Graham, thanks so much for joining me again on another Tuner Talk.
You bet.
All right, so there's a lot to cover here, but we're not going to try to take up people's time too much. But the big changes that everybody's been talking about recently is launch control and flatfoot shifting. I know a lot of tuners are getting inundated with tons of emails on how to change, how to even implement some of this stuff. So you've got a lot of experience on this stuff for an extended period of time. You want to talk a little bit about these features?
Yeah, certainly. So, so the launch control flatfoot shifting, something that people have been pretty much begging for since the beginning, because with an all-wheel drive car, it's certainly fun to launch it, and being able to hold a steady RPM and then, let the clutch out and go makes it so much easier than trying to kind of rev it, figure it out, and then take off. A lot of cars come with factory launch control, in these days. So, Subaru never has done that. So people wanted that. And then flatfoot shifting is kind of fun too. If you're racing your buddy, instead of having to lift the pedal, shift and put the foot back down and lose boost and have it come back in, you can just shift with the clutch and maintain the boost through the shift. So it's almost like an automatic or like a sequential gearbox almost at that point, where the power is just seamless back on, just on, off and on. So people wanted that for a while. So in order to put that in there, it wasn't like Cobb just, found some tables and turned them on, because they don't exist. This is where a lot of people don't understand what goes on behind the scenes when Cobb does things like flex fuel, or again, even just a simple launch control patch. They have to go in and start taking control of the logic and like the rev limiters, and be able to introduce their own logic that happens based on, zero vehicle speed, full pedal for launch control. And then, flat foot shifting is, you're hitting the clutch while you're keeping the pedal down. They have to add all that stuff in. So it's a custom code that they do, which means it's a new base ROM type, which means that the tuners have to open up that ROM type, copy everything over from your existing tune, save it for you, and send it to you. Cobb can't just easily go through people's customs tunes and turn this on.
Enable it for
so
them.
That's where the tuners are tied into it. So it's like, this comes out and the tuners are like, awesome, everyone's been asking for this. And it's like, oh crap, we've got to update hundreds of maps, some tuners are not, they're not doing a ton of VBWXs. They might have, like a handful to maybe 50 to 100, let's say they've done, because they're doing lots of other stuff. Not a huge deal. They're getting requests here and there, but guys like me and the other popular tuners that are out there, it was pretty crazy on day one with emails and contacts and courier pigeons flying in. I want my launch control right now. So we're like, oh crap, we got to do this. And, Cobb makes some tools that makes it pretty easy, but when as busy as we are sitting down and trying to find the time to do this patch and get it all set up and send it to you, and then send some instructions and inevitably get some emails back like, hey, this happened while I was using this. And it's like, use at your own risk, So anyway, we've been hit with that. So, but we are offering that. We are getting guys caught up for that. We're doing it personally for a small fee of $25. And when you get that done, we will also get you updated to our latest base settings. So if you tuned with us recently and just finished, you're probably just going to be getting the launch control flat foot shift. There's not going to be, a bunch of base changes, but every so often as I develop new strategies or find something that I like, it becomes part of our existing base files that everybody starts from. So if you've tuned with us a couple of years ago, you might be on our very first kind of base settings, and they're safe and they're happy. If we ever find something that we're like, uh-oh, this is not good, we proactively, it's almost like a recall on the tune. We would actively contact everybody that has that revision, because we keep track of all that. And we'd say, hey, here's an update, use this map. It's going to be small things that you might run into. Most people aren't going to see it. Oh, hi, Leo. Oh, hi, buddy. I know. Yes, you're feeling left out. So these base settings are, again, if we find something that was weird, we let everybody know. But generally, the base settings are just better and better ways of doing things. A lot of times, like my latest settings have more to do with like a balance of cold start, because these cars can be really loud. So I've been playing around with the rev overhang tables to kind of get a more smooth, when you come off the throttle, you don't want it to like, hang like you're still on the throttle. You also don't want it to like lurch forward. A lot of people like that kind of in between smooth. So there might be changes like that, throttle response. But anyway, any of those base settings, if you don't already have those, we're going to incorporate that into your tune, but we're going to have all of your specific tuning, which is generally around, airflow, boost, fuel, timing, the things that kind of make your tune yours. Those things are all going to stay the same. You're just going to get any of those underlying benefits, if that makes sense. And then, of course, launch control, flat foot shift. So I know that was a lot, but
it is.
That's what goes on.
It's, because and for myself, like I had launch control and flat foot shifting on my VAWRX, but I never used, actually, I didn't really use either of them. This time around, there's, now I have to kind of get into it as well. There are some settings that people do need to adjust. And I think it's just like setting RPMs, but it's you have to set an RPM for launch control, which does make sense, but you also have to set a setting for flat foot shifting. So can you kind of explain to some of us who don't really understand why you would have to set that?
Yep. So let me explain. So when we move somebody over to this new ROM, we enable those features, they're available, but the default values are set. We actually can't control the default values at the moment. On the VA and like an STI, we as the tuner can set starting values, and then you can adjust from there with your access port. Cobb has set it up at this point to where the default values are basically 8,000 RPM, an RPM you never get to, and you have to lower them down to where you want them to work. So we warn people about that. If you put, you flash this map and you go out there and you step on it, it's not gonna be working. You have to go into the access port settings and choose your RPMs. Mm-hmm. Now, launch control RPM, I'll talk about that first. What you're looking for there is you want to set it high enough that you're inducing a little bit of wheel spin when you launch, but not so high that you're just blowing to the rev limiter, right? Or you might kind of blow through the clutch, but that's a whole nother conversation because the ideal launch point is going to rely on the clutch being able to grab and transfer that into the wheels. You also don't want to be so low that you just basically bog off the line, because you're either, two things can happen. One, it's going to be a terrible launch, or two, that shock load, if the tires bite and don't slip and spin a little bit, that's where things can break in the drive line. Hopefully just axles would be the first thing that can tend to break. But, if you've got some grippy tires on there, and you could break things in the transmission on a launch by being too low and basically like dead hooking and transferring all that torque through the wrong places, and something breaks. So again, it's kind of like you want it to spin a little bit and then gain traction and go. And if you need to kind of pedal it with your, lift the pedal a little bit because you're spinning too much, then you want to do that. Or conversely, if you launch and the car's hopping the wheels, clutch that thing back in. Do not try to ride a hop out, because that is another place where things break. Okay. So that's kind of what you're playing with your RPM point. We recommend as a starting point 5,000 to 5,400. To some people, that seems high. They might think, I'm going to launch at 3,000 or 4,000, but you'd be surprised that a lot of times that won't be enough unless you're on maybe all seasons or cold weather. You got to think about all these things, but generally 5,000 to 5,400 is where you want to launch. And then, if people ask us about technique, the trick there is you don't want to sidestep the clutch because that shocks everything. You also don't want to go real slow because you're going to slip the clutch and wear it out. Yeah. I always tell people it's just bring your foot out quick. Like you just stepped in dog crap and you picked your foot out. That's the technique that I recommend. And as long as your clutch is strong enough, that'll generally bring it right through the catch point, get those tires spinning, and take off smoothly. So that's launch control. Now, flat foot shift, what we're doing here essentially is we need to cut the power, because you can flat foot shift the car without flat foot shifting. It's called power shifting. You essentially just don't lift the throttle. You smash that clutch pedal and grab the next gear. What happens is when you hit the clutch, the RPMs on the engine shoot up because it's not connected to the transmission. And they'll just go to the rev limiter if you don't shift quick enough. They'll bang off the rev limiter, and then when the clutch comes back out, they'll swing back down to where you're landing. So if you're a really fast shifter, sometimes you can shift so fast with a power shift without flat foot shifting that it'll be pretty smooth. But your problem is your RPMs end up here when really the next gear is down here. Right. And it has to drag it back down. And that's, again, where things can break in the driveline. The idea of flat foot shift is that as you're coming up and you clutch to make the shift, but you stay on the pedal, you want to stop the RPMs from moving and kind of let them start to fall back down to that, close to that next point where the gear is going to land when you shift. Okay. So the idea there is you don't want it to be resting too high. So too high of an RPM value and it'll be up and have to kind of catch itself back up. Too low of an RPM value, and when it comes back in, it's going to have to get itself back up to that next RPM point. So the biggest thing is to take a look at where your shifts are landing. So say they're landing at about 5,400 RPMs when you shift. What I recommend is being a couple hundred RPMs above that for the flat foot shift point. So like 5,600 would work well. Now, if you're shifting closer to 6,000 and your shifts are landing at 5, then 52, 53 might work.
Okay.
So you play with it, but generally shoot for a few hundred RPM above where your shifts are going to land so that the RPMs are starting to fall. But if you shift slow, they're kind of waiting for you, so to speak. And that should feel pretty good. You know, if it feels harsh, you know, it's having to like pick back up, or it's having to bring the RPMs down. If it feels kind of harsh, then play around with it. But that's what I recommend for flat foot shifting. And then the other thing too is, I can't stress this enough, is practice on the 3/4 shift, because that's an easy one to go straight, you know. 1-2 happens pretty fast, so it's easy to miss. And then 2-3, you're having to move over and find the gate. And if you're thinking about your gas pedal and your clutch pedal and you put that stick back into first gear after second, bad things are going to happen.
Yeah.
Money shift, and they get expensive, and that's why they call it that. So you really want to be a proficient at shifting with lifting. You want to be a good quick shifter, but you want to take your time. Just because you're flat foot shifting doesn't mean you want to start ramming that stick fast as you can. You're going to hurt things. And that's what people ask too, is flat foot shifting going to break my transmission? The answer is it can, because you're certainly removing and reintroducing torque very quickly versus lifting and rolling back on it. But when you do fast lift shifting, you still kind of introduce torque pretty quickly. So certainly can still find some limits of the stock transmission, but flat foot shifting certainly makes that happen quicker. The biggest way people break their transmission is flat foot shifting is they start shifting faster. They're like, oh, I got to hurry up and get this shift done, you know, because I'm not lifting, you know. But reality is that, you know, you have time to get the shift done. You don't have to hammer it into the next gear. You can do a nice, smooth, clean shift and still enjoy the benefits of flat foot shift. So
yeah, I mean,
that's kind of my caveat on all that.
This is all great. I know it's been out in the wild for about a week, 2 weeks now, and I haven't heard of anybody blowing anything up. But I feel like this is where we're going to start seeing some limits of the transmission, because I know already some people have already broken like their gear and stuff, and the number one question is, should I launch or should I use flat foot shifting? And it's like you said, it's pretty much all of this is use at your own risk, all of it.
Absolutely.
Like anything when it comes to modding.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. And so obviously there are a couple of things that people do need to know, because I did see this as well, is you have to update the access port. You have to get updated maps, because I did actually see a few people who did update their access port and didn't get updated maps, but then you will no longer be able to use the previous maps that you already have.
Yes. So that's another thing too, is you have to contact your tuner. Your tuner has to get your maps up to the latest version essentially, or they stop working. So Cobb kind of put a lot on the tuners to some degree to make this all happen.
Yeah.
Just because of the nature of it. But, you know, those of us that, you know, take care of people, we're figuring out how to make it work.
Okay, cool. All right. Anything else you want to add on the launch control and all that? Because now, before we move on, because there is this, and I didn't know about this. This is something that you've mentioned, and I've actually heard from a couple of other tuners as well, is now that people are using launch control and using flat foot shifting, they may see some wonky numbers on their access port.
Yep.
So this actually leads us into our next conversation, which I know we've all seen this a lot, is the dam, find knock learn, and feedback knock. So I really wanted you to kind of help set the record straight on how these things affect our day-to-day driving, and then also these extra features that we have, and like what are things that we really should be watching out for. Sure.
Okay. So yeah, so your point, yes, when we send out these launch control flat foot shift maps, we do warn people that you very well might see more fine learned feedback knock than normal, than you're used to seeing. If your number is, if you normally don't see any, especially like on E85, for example, you might start to see a little bit when you're doing flat foot shifts, because a lot of times it's not even really real knock necessarily, but it's the engine's moving around, the motor mounts start banging off each other because they're stock and they're rubber. and that's inducing some false knock. But also, these features are hard on things. You are, again, cutting and resuming fueling, which can potentially create some knock, especially on like lower grade fuels. It might move the dam when you make a shift, especially like if you're really hammering it and you're doing that flat foot shift into fifth and then sixth, and that thing's not getting any kind of a break in the cylinder temps, you might see the dam move. So we warn people about that indeed. So, but yeah, I know from when you were visiting, we kind of touched on the knock control system, and we decided it would be a really interesting segue, or interesting to go into some heavier detail like we do on these talks about how the knock control system works on these cars. And I want to actually try to educate people so they understand what is happening. What do the numbers mean? So I don't want to go into a ton of detail and lose people on how the tuning all works. So I'm going to try to make it, easy and understandable, but I'm going to talk a little bit about ignition timing, because that's the component that knock is changing. I'm going to talk a little bit about what knock is, and then I'll kind of explain what the three things are and how they work.
Got it.
The cool thing about this is, a lot of VB guys watch your channel, so this is going to apply to them for sure. And I'll try to kind of explain some of the things that are different about the VB, but by and large, the knock control system on the VB-WRX is actually very similar to what Subaru started with on a 2002 WRX. So it hasn't changed in all these years, which is really crazy. It still uses those three components of fine learning, which is kind of like a learned knock in specific areas of the load and RPM range. Feedback knock, which is your immediate knock correction. If it sees knock, it reacts to it under certain conditions. And then your DAM, which stands for dynamic advanced multiplier. It's basically, that's kind of like an octane learning number. That number on early Subarus, it goes from 0 to 16. And then basically starting with the drive-by-wire cars in 04, they changed it from 0 to 1, and it's still 0 to 1. So all the same principles and strategies haven't really changed over the years. Now, Subaru, with different engines, especially the direct injection engines, they have kind of changed how aggressively they'll use the system. They've also changed, the VB-WRX, when, you mentioned Cobb said that it's different. The VB-WRX certainly jumps to moving the dam a lot sooner than even the VA-WRX or the STIs. They'll lean on the fine learning knock, kind of like the learned over time knock, and the feedback knock. They'll lean on that a lot more, and it takes more knock being seen to get the dam to move on those cars. The VBs, if it gets a little bit unsure and it's hearing too much, it can move that pretty quickly, which is why guys see that, and it's become kind of a hot topic on these cars. Yeah. So that's kind of the overview. So to take a deeper dive into it, what I was going to explain was what do these numbers mean, and what is changing. Basically, the whole idea with an engine is, you want it to run the most amount of ignition advance, which is, when you're lighting the spark, when you're firing the spark to light the fuel mixture, you want to fire it at an ideal angle before the piston is at the top, so that by the time the explosion happens, it pushes down the piston with the most amount of torque possible. When you're talking about very light cruise loads, you need to start that spark very early, many degrees, 20 to 40 degrees before the top of the piston is where you want to be, so that, you have the right torque for cruising. As you've got more boost in there and the piston's moving faster, that starts to change when you want to fire the spark. And that's when you start to get more sensitive around, if you don't fire the spark at the right time, if you're firing it too early, you can start to basically explode the fuel before the pistons reach the top. And if that happens, that is what creates the knock sound. It's basically the explosion's happening while the piston's still trying to travel up. And that's very damaging on things. You need to let the explosion happen as the piston's starting to, move back down. So when the knock sensor hears that, it takes action by lowering or reducing the advance. In other words, not firing the spark quite so early before the piston gets to the top. Instead, it waits longer and fires it closer to the top, so that, again, it's pushing down at the right time and not making that basically knock sound of the piston trying to move and the explosion hitting it. Is that making sense the way I'm explaining that?
It is. Yeah.
It's wild, but that's what's going on inside there. If you explode the fuel before the piston's in the right spot, you will damage the piston. That shock can go through and damage the rod bearings, bend the rods. All kinds of bad things can happen down the line, if you're having uncontrolled detonation, they call it, or knock.
Is this like the pinging sound that people would hear?
I describe it as, it sounds like you've like picked up gravel with your tire, and it sounds like gravel or rocks like hitting like a metal skid plate. It's kind of like a sort of like, or another way I describe it is when you shake a paint can and it's got the BBs inside of it, that kind of like sound of those BBs rattling around inside of a paint can. It sounds a little like that. If you have a pretty quiet car and you're having pretty heavy knock, you can hear it pretty audibly. I was doing a VA WRX on the dyno a couple days ago, and he had a pretty quiet car, and in my dyno cell it was quiet enough. I could hear the knock audibly. It was happening with some really crappy 91. I could hear it right as it was counting up on the software.
Yeah.
So I could notice it. Now I cleaned it up and I made it quite a bit better to where I stopped hearing it, but I could still see it in the tune, or in the data. So the knock sensor can hear it better than we can, but if it gets loud enough, you can hear it again, kind of that rattly noise. And if you're hearing it rattle, that's when it's really dangerous. If the knock sensor is just picking up a little bit of it, that's survivable. That's something where it's okay to have a little bit of it. It's not always going to be zero, unless the tuner is desensitizing it to that noise, by, through the tuning essentially. So that's a whole nother conversation. I won't open that can of worms today, but basically, so you want the car to run at the optimal ignition angle, right? To make the most amount of torque that you can make, which translates to horsepower. But you don't want to have knock. If you have knock, you need to reduce the amount of timing. So what the OEM strategy is trying to do, they're trying to always run the most amount of timing you can. And if they hear knock, they react to it. Again, sometimes immediately with the feedback. So if it hears a little bit of knock, it does some negative, like the feedback will go -1, -2. Each time it's going an increment of 1, that is a degree of timing being removed. Okay, so if at a given point in the engine, RPMs and load, let's say it's just arbitrary 10 degrees of timing is what the map is calling for, and you see a -2 feedback knock, it is changing the ignition timing to 8 degrees instead of 10.
Got
it's
it.
They call it taking out 2 degrees of timing, essentially, is what the feedback is doing. And if that works, you got to remember the engine is firing many times per second, right? At different RPMs, right?
Yeah.
If that reduction, it does that reduction and it listens, and if the knock stops, then it will slowly reduce that negative timing and it'll go back to 0. And if everything stays happy, then it will kind of go away. So that's where you can see the feedback knock come in temporarily to deal with a light knock condition and then fade back out, especially as you go into higher RPMs and the knock may not be present there, that goes away. The fine learn knock, if you're driving and the ECU, hears knock in an area, it's like, oh, there was some knock. And then you go through that area again in a short window of time. It's like, oh, there it was again. Oh, there it was again. Okay, this is a problem spot, is basically what the ECU is thinking. So one of its strategies is to remember that spot. Basically, it has a matrix in the tune of load points and RPM points that exist, kind of looks like a table. So if you're at 3,000 RPM and you're at a load of 2, you'll be in this box. A load of 3, you'll be in this box. Higher RPMs, you'll come down. It has this table. It'll reduce the timing in that box, essentially.
Okay.
So it'll start with maybe 1 degree or 2 degrees. And now you'll notice that when you come back through that spot, you don't see feedback knock. Instead, you see fine learn knock. Now you see your fine learning is -2 in that spot, let's say where your feedback was -2. Now, basically, every time you're going through that spot, the ECU is constantly removing that bit of ignition advance in that spot. Because it decided that, for whatever reason right now, fuel quality or whatever, where you're at, your car needs that to avoid knock in that spot. You follow me?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
And so now what happens is the opposite is it if it starts going through those spots in a short window of time, it's like, oh, there's no knock. There's no knock. Okay, let's try taking a little bit of that. We'll call it, it's called ignition retard. Let's take some of that ignition retard back out and listen again. Okay, we're still clean. And eventually, if it's not hearing knock in those areas, it will reduce that back to 0. And it will stop having the long-term fine learn knock in that area. That's kind of how that works. If you reset your ECU, it'll also put that back to 0.
I see.
Right, exactly. So
even if it was there, it's going back to 0. This is why a lot of people tend to say, oh, well, if it comes back after ECU reset, there might be a real issue.
So yeah, exactly. That table gets reset when you reset your ECU. And just like the dam goes back to its initial starting point. So we'll get to the dam in a second. So now we understand there's immediate correction that happens with with feedback knock. And then there's sort of a longer term fine learn knock that the ECU can rely on. Generally on the older Subarus, it leans on those two things quite a bit first. The VB is kind of unique where it starts with feedback and it seems like a very small window where it will do some learning. And then if that's not getting the job done pretty quickly, it'll move right into moving the dam. Now let me explain what the dam is. So that's the advanced multiplier. I like to describe this as sort of the ECU's a broad stroke approach to dealing with knock. Feedback is very specific, very immediate. Fine learn is sort of in the certain areas where it needs it. Dam is essentially everywhere. Okay. So if the dam moves, the timing is being reduced everywhere. The timing advance is being reduced everywhere. The ignition timing on these Subarus, again, going all the way back to 02, it exists in the tune in two parts, a base table and an advanced table. And basically those tables get added together, but the advanced table gets multiplied by the dam first. So let's go arbitrary numbers again. Let's say that in a given spot in your base map, you have 5 degrees of ignition advance at a certain load and RPM. And over in your advanced table at that same load and RPM, let's say you have 10 degrees there. It takes that 10, multiplies it by the dam. So let's say it's 1 and you get the full 10. It adds it to your 5, you get 15 in that spot. Now let's say your dam suddenly goes to 0.5. It gets cut in half. Now it's taking 10 times 0.5 and it's getting 5 and it's adding it to the 5. And then so you just, in that swoop, it reduced 5 degrees of timing.
Just across the RPM.
Example. Yep. That's a pretty extreme example. Generally in the base mapping for Subaru, they're, when the dam is moving, if the dam gets cut in half, generally they're trying to take out 2 to 4 degrees of timing sort of everywhere. Now it kind of depends because their map's laid out, it looks like very splotchy, like this area might have this area of the advanced map might have 10 and this area only has 2. Kind of their strategy there is they've determined that area with the big numbers to be more sensitive versus the other areas so that the dam can kind of apply that way. Generally, when other tuners tune these cars, the way Cobb has kind of showed to do it, the way I've done it, the way I think most other tuners do it is they set the advanced table to being more smooth values, let's say, like, so it might be 10 everywhere, or it might be 6 or whatever the tuner kind of likes to use. The bigger the number that you put in your advanced table, the more effect the dam moving has.
Right. Yeah, because of the multiplication.
Yeah. So I remember in the early days of tuning, there were some guys that had no idea what they're doing, and I would look at logs and I'd see these guys only have like 3 or 4 degrees in the advanced table. So the dam's not able to, doesn't have much authority, so to speak. They got most of their timing over in the base table. But the other part is true. You wouldn't want to put a ton of your timing advance in your advanced table, because if the dam does move, let's say under false knock, you might get really low with your ignition timing, way below what the engine is happy to run at. The engine has to be within a certain range. You can't just, you can't take an engine that has a typical requirement of certain ignition timing at a certain RPM load and suddenly change it by -10 degrees. It's not going to run well. It's going to have crazy exhaust temperatures. there's kind of there's a happy medium. Again, like we talked about, you're trying to fire the spark and ignite the fuel at the right time to move the piston down appropriately. If you wait way too long and the piston's already heading down and then you light it, well, what happens is that burn starts going into an open exhaust valve, and then your valves are getting hot, your turbo's getting hot. That's essentially what anti-lag is. That's what you're doing, is you're purposely lighting it as the exhaust valve is opening so that you can put a bunch of heat and pressure against your turbo. But again, that's not good for the engine. You wouldn't want to, be running around like that
all the time.
Lighting the mixture really late. So that's why it's important to make sure that you have logical, sensible values in your advanced table for the dam to work against. So there's that. Now, here's something else that's interesting, is that the dam on these cars doesn't just work with the timing. It can also change the boost, and it can also change the fueling, which is actually really nice, because that means that so the feedback and the fine learn, they're only focused on ignition timing. That's the only variable that they're changing. But the dam will actually, depending on how the tuners choose to use it, the dam can actually start to reduce boost targets, and it can also start to enrich the fueling, again, to help control knock. It's not just reliant on the timing, which is nice. So that's a strategy that I use in my tuning, is if your dam moves down from 1, I do some boost pressure reduction, which helps make sure knock stays under control. If you did, say, get some bad fuel in your tank, or you're out, you didn't tell me that you're taking your car on the racetrack in 100-degree weather, and I didn't send you a track to, and you're out there just giving it the beans, then the dam's going to move, and it's going to protect your engine by reducing essentially your ignition timing, your boost, and running a richer fuel target to make the engine stay safe. So that's all the things the dam does. So this is the funny thing, is when people say, my dam moved, my dam shouldn't move, I don't want my dam to move on my tune. No, that's backwards thinking. You actually do want your dam to move when it needs to. That's the thing. This is the thing that's going to, people are going to see this and be like, wait a minute. He said the dam is good to move. Well, yes and no. Obviously, you don't want, you wouldn't want a tune that's tuned too aggressive, and every time you make a pull, your dam has to drop. Seeing that much knock. But if you get your tune completed with me, let's say, for example, and we've done all the testing, we've done all the logs, I've had you do pulls through the gears, everything looks great, right? And you've had 0 issues for several months, and all of a sudden you go get some gas on the other side of town at a station you haven't been to, and it says 93, it's fine. But then, you drive a little bit and you make a pull, and it's like, my dam moved, that's weird. Similar weather conditions, similar use, no mods change, nothing. My dam dropped. Well, you call me and you say, hey, something's wrong with the tune, bro. Like, my dam's dropping now. It hasn't been for months, but it is. And I say, well, did you fill up somewhere different? And they're like, well, yeah, I use this gas station over here I haven't used before. And I'm like, okay, the dam is doing what it was supposed to do. The tune is doing what it was supposed to do. That fuel is probably inducing some knock, and the dam is moving so that it lowers the power and it keeps it safe. So I tell people, run that fuel out of your car, drive it easy, fill up with your usual station, and try it again. And 99 times out of 100, everything goes back to normal.
Yep.
So it was good that the dam dropped. If I tuned the car in a way where it didn't react to that bad fuel, that could hurt the engine, because it would be having to, it might lean on the feedback and the fine learn knock well enough, but again, it's having to expose itself to more detonation to work.
To make more corrections.
Yes. So again, the dam, ideally, if the tune is good and the fuel's good and you're not beating it beyond its safe limits, the dam should stay at 1, and we don't want it to be moving all the time. But if it does move, there's a reason for it generally.
And that's with tunes from the tuners. So we're going to add one more thing in here. You look at like the OTS. Obviously, one could say that is they're conservative tunes. So would you say what they have said in there is with more precautions, because people tend to see the dam move a lot on OTS tunes?
So let's walk it back even farther. If you wanted to do an interesting test on your car, if your car's all stock, especially like if you've got 91 octane where you live, flash your car to the stage 0 map. The stage 0 map is the stock tune, but it is basically the access port married. You can log everything. And you'd probably be surprised to find, especially in warmer weather, the dam is almost never at 1. On 91 octane,
Yeah.
It's going to be using that number as basically octane learning, essentially. That's kind of its underlying OEM purpose. A lot of other manufacturers have a similar number that's basically so the car can blend between different fuel qualities, and they can sell it to everybody everywhere. But if you were to look at that on a 91 car on a stock tune, it moves a lot. Cobb provides specific fuel maps. They have a 91 OTS, they have a 93 OTS. What they've done is they have basically reduced the timing or set things up in a way where during their testing, under good conditions, the dam doesn't have to move to keep the car from having, heavy knock. So that's the way the OTS maps work. But there is some ability in the custom tuning to adjust how aggressively the knock control system works and responds, and kind of when it responds. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail there, because for one, it's very complex, and two, it kind of turns into a bit of a conversation about each tuner's, proprietary strategy.
Right.
So,
okay.
But what I will say is if tuners are doing things the right way, then they're testing these cars on the dyno under stressful conditions with, equipment that can, monitor knock, and they should be developing a strategy that they feel is still very safe and can move the dam when needed. But I'll say that I think there is an appropriate amount of adjustment above and beyond Cobb that can keep the dam at one under normal safe conditions, but move when it needs to, if that makes sense. So in other words, we in my opinion, we can optimize things a little bit better and not have the dam be quite so reactive, but still react when it needs to, versus OTS. So that's kind of the thing where other tuners have obviously done that same thing. Hopefully they've done it well. Hopefully they haven't just, basically turned off the knock sensor. I'll say that I've heard rumors. I can't substantiate it, but I've seen situations where, I've looked at logs and it does not look good. It's not happy, but the dam won't move. I'm not saying those tuners in those situations made it so they can't move, but I'll say that it's possible to do in the software. If you want to create a tune for these cars or any other car that doesn't have the dam ever move, it's very easy to do. That's the truth. So take that information as you will. But if you think, I'll just say that, if you're using somebody that doesn't seem reputable and it seems too good to be true, and you're on the internet and you're like, man, I can beat my car all day on 91, 23 pounds of boost on my BBWX and my dam never drops. There might be a reason for it that you don't, you may not be happy to find out. So again, it's another one of those things where, a lot of us tuners that, are trying to educate people and help people understand. And they're like, well, my dam never drops with this tuner, or my, dam should never drop. We're all vocalizing the fact that no, actually under the right conditions, your dam should drop, because that means your knock control system has the authority for it to drop, to move, because that's how it's designed.
Got it.
That makes sense?
Oh yeah, because and I'm glad that you mentioned the stage 0 map, because I actually I don't remember exactly what the situation was where I actually was running the stage 0 map on my car for I'd say a week or two. And that's the one thing that I noticed, that even on 93, where I would always get my gas from, sometimes when I was just cruising, my dam would just start dropping, even just regular cruising. And it was really weird, because one of the earlier racing videos that I was doing, I couldn't understand why sometimes I would do a pull with my buddy and I'd be ahead, and other times I'd be way, way behind, even within the same 15-minute time period. And it wasn't until I saw that and I was like, okay, I guess maybe there is something that's going on with the car that's making it slower, because it was confusing to me. But what was really interesting was I wasn't really having to do a whole lot of extra to get that dam to come back up, other than just, I'd say, a couple of pulls, and the dam would just slowly start rising on its own. Yeah.
So that's a good thing. I didn't actually cover that. I meant to, is, so when does the dam choose to move? So basically, again, long story short, if the feedback's not getting under control, or it's more than it feels like the fine learning can deal with, if it's hearing the knock and it's moving through those fine learned zones, right? And nothing's helping, that's when the dam will move. And then the question I always get is, well, how do I get my dam back to 1? Well, there's 2 ways. One, as you just alluded to, you'll notice that if you're just driving around easy, the dam doesn't relearn itself. The dam only learns when it's in an area where it could see knock. That usually means some part throttle boost. So I'll recommend to people, put it in 4th gear and kind of run it at like 5, 6, 7, 8 PSI and take it up from, up into like 5,000 RPM range. And if the ECU is not hearing knock in that kind of medium load area, it will move it back up over time, but it takes some time. And a lot of times it'll that last little bit of getting it back to 1, somebody will contact me and say, well, it went to 0.5 on a hard shift that I missed, and then it learned itself back to 0.92, but it won't go any higher. Sometimes that last little bit can be hard to get. That's just kind of because of the way it's kind of calibrated and tuned. It's very specific to kind of hit a window or a time or whatever. We don't even honestly, even Cobb doesn't necessarily know all of the ins and outs of exactly how it works. So it might be hard to get that last bit. The easy solution is to reset your ECU. That puts it back to its starting point that's in the tune. Now, that's another interesting thing too, is the factory tune, the starting point is not 1.0, it's 0.7. So basically, if you reset the ECU on stage 0, or if your tuner has chosen to use a lower starting point and they're relying on the dam, it may not start back at 1. Cobb OTS and most tuners, including us, we like to start the dam back at 1. Basically, put the ECU, we tune for your fuel, your mods, and best case scenario to where the dam doesn't need to go down on a regular basis. So we like to start it at 1 and then let it come down if it needs to. So a reset will put it back to 1, and then you can monitor it. Now, here's another thing too that we've noticed, and I don't know if it's confirmed with Cobb, but I've done enough testing and seen enough logs and been on the dyno enough to feel like there's some truth that right after you flash a map or do an ECU reset, I believe that there's kind of a short window of time of higher sensitivity. In other words, the ECU is sort of paying attention closer right after you flash a map or right after you've reset the ECU. So you're kind of in this delicate window where it might be more likely to move the dam again. I recommend people, if they're looking into this, is to do some easy part throttle, kind of let the ECU sort of get its nerves back, so to speak, if we're treating it like it's a person. Let it kind of see some more favorable conditions and kind of ease out of that learning period. Again, I can't confirm that there is that condition, but I have seen that so many times to feel like that could be a reality. So again, kind of let the ECU see some easy driving and then slowly introduce a pull. And if the dam stays at 1 and everything's back to normal, great. If it's still dropping, let's say, you've been having an issue with it, we need to dig a little bit deeper. Maybe look at logs. Maybe it's, we tried to keep your tune safe, but you've moved and your fuel quality's gone down, or you moved from low elevation to high elevation, or any different things. So you might need a tune adjustment, or again, might need to try some different fuel, or might need to do spark plugs or other maintenance, that could be causing this, because a lot of things can cause, the knock system to start kicking up when it didn't used to. So
now, so the resetting the ECU, I want to bring that up because, is there any instance where you'll reset the ECU and the dam doesn't change?
No, a reset will always change the dam back to whatever its tuned starting value is. So generally in a custom tune or an OTS tune, it's going to go back to 1.
Okay.
It should always go back because
it should always go back. Now, is that resetting ECU or even when doing reflashing?
Reflashing does a reset in the process too.
I see.
So again, it should always go back at that point.
Okay. It's like every time we talk about this stuff, we think, okay, we're just going to kind of just touch base on it, but it does get pretty complicated. But I mean, this is something that every other, I'd say, especially because we have so many new WRX owners, is I want to say at least once or twice a week, there is a question about dam. There's a question about feedback knock. And even though Cobb does have a lot of these things set on their website, people don't always go back and read. And
no.
Yeah.
I'll say really quick. So if anybody is listen to all this and they're like, man, I wish I could read this somewhere, on my website, boostedperformancetuning.com, under, is it tech? If you go out to our website and you go go to our tech section. I have a lot of interesting write-ups out there. Now, it's not built out as I would like, but I do have a Subaru knock correction tab out there. And we send this to people. Anytime we get like somebody contacts us and says, oh, my knock is doing crazy things or whatever, I have them read this. It's a pretty long read, but basically it's a write out of everything that I just explained to you, essentially. It explains each one of the 3 components, explains how they work, explains how we do our tuning approach. Also, we have a whole section of, causes of knock correction. So there's some things you can do to troubleshoot to try to figure out what's going on. So that's a good resource for people that have questions because it explains how this works like I just did today.
That's good. I'll have to put that in the description because not everybody watches some of these tuner talk videos all the way through. Some people do actually like to go back and read stuff too. So this is really good.
Yeah, link them over to that.
I'll definitely, because like the Cobb one is pretty basic. It's like here, this is what this is what it does, this is what it does. And I have done a video some time ago where I kind of like went through that based off my experiences because I've had so many tunes and I've done a lot of racing where I've seen all my numbers change drastically.
Oh yeah.
So there's definitely something to be said, especially where you mentioned where people will go, let's say they're going to a track day or even like a drag racing day with just what their regular tune is. Now, is that something that you recommend people to do before they're doing something? Let's say somebody is going to Grid Life or somebody's going to like a legit track day. Would you recommend that they do contact you before they do that to make sure that their car is ready or their tune is ready?
Yeah, it's not a bad idea to get a track specific tune, which is something that we offer. And the reason for that is, I think we've covered this in the past, maybe not. I'll hit it again really quick. But when we do an email tune or like a street tune for somebody, it's designed to be used on the street. When you drive your car on the street, now if you go to Mexico and you're getting out there, you can certainly get a little bit rowdy on the street. But generally speaking, the tune is designed to be something where you're not flogging on it for laps at a time for 15 minutes. Generally speaking, it's hard to drive your car that hard on the street as you can out there on the track. So a track tune, what it basically does is it creates a bigger safety cushion. It runs less boost. It has a bit more conservative timing mapping and fueling mapping. Yes, it makes anywhere from 10 to 20 horsepower less than your street tune does, but that's by design. So that you can flog it and you have a bigger margin before it starts to have to, lean on the knock sensors or anything else. Now, if you're on ethanol, generally, it's relatively safe to run around on ethanol on the track. It's more so pump gas that becomes the more sensitive on the track and more likely to have knock. One way to mitigate that if you don't want to do a track tune is a lot of tracks have race gas, needs to be unleaded, but blend some race gas in, bump your octane up. That works too.
And this is on 93?
93 or 91.
Okay.
You can, if the track has 100 octane at the pump, it might cost you $8 a gallon, but go over there and run some of that, mix some, go up to a 50-50 mix and you'll have basically 95, 96 octane, depending on what you're starting from. And it will have a lot less tendency to want to knock and pull power while you're on the track if you're using pump gas. Again, if you're on E85 can certainly take a lot more than, so you can get away with it. But still, if somebody contacts us that runs E85 and they're going to, they need a track map, I'm still going to dial things back again so that we can keep our coolant temperatures, oil temperatures, and some of that stuff more under control by putting less heat into the engine by running less power. It can be more ideal in that situation.
Yeah, because I think when you're on the track, that extra 10 horsepower is the trade-off is you're going to make it. You're going to make it to the end of the race because like some people may not make it to the end of the race. And
true.
I will be honest, like the 2-3 times that I've been to the track with this car, I think only once I asked you, like, is this okay? And we were using our blend map and you're like, nope, I think it's going to be fine. And I really had no problems other than I didn't have an oil cooler at the time. So my oil temperatures were way, way, way above. Besides that, the car, not once did it have any issues on the track. So
certainly
I'm happy with that. Anyway, I think that's a lot of information. I think it's a really good place to stop. Is there anything else you can think of that maybe you want people to know about feedback or the launch control or anything like that?
I think we covered it. This should be a good one for people to chew on.
Yeah. So like Graham said, if you guys, I'll put this down in the description, but on his website, he does have all this stuff. If you're looking for launch control or flatfoot shifting, obviously definitely reach out to you. I am hoping to get, obviously I still need to get, I don't even have my maps yet from you. Like I haven't been, I'm not, I want to get it, but there's no real rush for me. It's like, I got to have it today. Everybody was like,
Yeah.
I need a day first. I'm like, what? So you do like one pull and go back to not doing it again?
Yeah.
I do want to get those maps from you because I want to do a video of like showcasing those things, and you know, this is great now because now I have a starting point because I didn't know that that it started out at 8,000. That would be something that I would need to set, because I'm sure how many people sat down for the first time and put their foot down and realized like, oh, there's no launch control, but it needed to be set.
I'm sure it's probably happened. Yeah. Like I said, we put some stark warnings in there when I send it, but you know, people don't read, they get excited, they just copy it and go. So
you know, it's new users. That's just how it is.
Yep.
Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope this was really informative, because for me, this is like, the more you talk about this stuff, the more it kind of makes me, and we've talked about this, it kind of makes me want to get into tuning because it is so fascinating. And I think by like the 50th tuner talk, I think I'll be ready to tune cars.
Yeah. I always tell people, like, you know, I try to be an open book. Like, I'm not going to explain my personal strategies, but if somebody wants to know how things work, it's not a secret. You can go learn it. You know, I like to try to educate and teach, because honestly, like some of my favorite customers are the ones that understand a lot about tuning. They're not confident in tuning their cars, but they know what they're looking at. You know, you can become a more informed owner of the car if you understand how these things work, especially like understanding how the knock control works and what things mean is super valuable, you know, and then we could have a whole conversation about fueling and air fuel ratios and that too. So, you know, we can certainly kind of segue into some more of that stuff too, to kind of help people understand more about how do engines work and what's, you know, how's that apply to Subarus and how's that apply to what you see on your access port or your gauges? Because again, like you said, it is fascinating, and it makes you, you know, makes you a better owner of the car.
And I think I enjoy the car
more, you know.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, Graham, thank you again so much for coming. And I think I'll take you up on that. I think we'll talk about engines and fueling again in the future.
That sounds good.
Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next one.